Hello and welcome to the video everyone. In this video, I'm going to explain in detail about the chess pieces and pawns, which will include their face value, their movement and placement, and some special moves like en passant, castling, and pawn promotion. We'll also learn in short detail about their strengths and weaknesses. However, we will not go in depth into the strategies. We'll also be learning why and how the value of your pieces change as the game progresses, depending on where your pieces are placed. So you will learn about resource management, and this skill may carry over to other things you will encounter, not just in chess. So let's begin by looking at the starting position, which we have learned to set up from the previous video, where I talked about the chessboard. If you have not watched it yet, I will put a link in the description. So starting off with the pawn, each player get 8 pawns each. So the pawns start at the second rank of the starting position. So if I flip the board, it's the same for black. So as the algebraic notations, the board is inverted. So the pawn starts from the seventh rank as per black. So now how the pawn moves is that pawn can only move forward and it cannot move backwards. Now, when the pawns are in the initial starting position, the pawn have two options they can play. Can either move one square at a time or two square at a time. Let's say, for example, I move the pawn two squares at a time, and the opponent plays a random move like e5. Then the pawn cannot move forward because the path of the pawn is blockaded by the opponent's pawn. So now for the capture. So if I put the pawn here and the opponent moves the pawn there, how the pawn captures is that it captures diagonally. So if there's an opponent's piece or a pawn in the diagonal position, then he can capture the pawn. Now, because there's no opponent's piece or pawn in this square, he can move there. So he can just capture on this side. So he captures on b5. Now for the on person move rule. So what this move is that if the opponent plays something like this and your pawn is right next to it, so what you can do is you can capture the pawn like this diagonally. Although there is no enemy pieces or pawn in that square, you can actually capture this pawn by moving your pawn there. So how you can do is just move the pawn there and you can capture the enemy pawn. Let's say, for example, you don't want to immediately capture the pawn over here. So if you make just a random move, say you move here, and if the opponent plays something like a random move, so they move here. Now it's your turn to play. So you want to capture this pawn, and as for the on position rule, you want to capture this pawn, but you can't do it right now because it says that you can only capture the pawn immediately after the opponent has played this move. Otherwise, you forfeit the luxury of playing the en passant move. Now, let's suppose that we have reached this position. The pawns can also deliberate checkmate. So let's suppose it's black to move. So if black decides to promote to a queen, the white can still deliberate checkmate by moving his pawn there. Now the black king cannot move any place, and it's checkmate. Now for the promotion of the pawn, let's suppose that both the players have reached this kind of position. So white has moved his pawns forward, and so has black. So now what white can do if it's its move is that he can just move this pawn forward and he can promote to a queen, a rook, or a bishop, or a knight. So he can promote to any of these four pieces. Suppose he already has two bishops on the board. Now he can still promote to a third bishop. So if he moves the pawn there, he can still bring out a bishop and have three bishops on the board. So this rule applies to not just the bishop, but all the other pieces too. Let's say, for example, this pawn now promotes to a knight. And let's say there were already two other knights on the board, so it can still promote to a knight. And the same thing with the rook. You can still promote to a rook. And if there were, let's say, queen, you can still promote to a queen. Even if you had like two or three queens, you can still bring another queen on the board, and it wouldn't matter. Same thing is for the other pieces. So the first piece I want to talk about are the bishops. So these are the bishops, just besides the king and queen. So let me just clear out the board and put some bishops on the board. So these bishops moves in a diagonal path. So likewise you can see in the screen. So as you are given two bishops at the starting of the position, the bishops can only go to the same color square as they start on. So, for example, let's say this bishop starts on a light colored square. So it can only move on to the light colored square. It can never move on to the dark colored squares. Same with the dark colored bishop. It can only move on to the dark colored squares and it can move on to the light colored square. So you can say both of these bishops complement each other. So let's say, for example, let's point out the arrows on which it can move on to. So these bishops are able to complement each other and restrict the mobility of enemy pieces, you can say. And as both of them are long range attacking piece, both of them are able to look onto the enemy's territory from a safe distance and are really great at both attack and defense as they can quickly move from one place to the other side of the board easily. So the next piece I want to talk about is the rook. So how the rook moves is that it either moves in a vertical path or a horizontal path in a straight line. So the rook can move to either of these squares that I have pointed out. So let's say, for example, there is an enemy piece on the way. Let's say the enemy piece is on e6 square. So where the rook can move is it can either move to these squares till where it can see, and if it wants to move on to e6 square, it can move there and occupy the square, capturing the enemy piece. And let's say, for example, there is a own piece on the way. Let's say there's a knight. So how the rook can move in this situation is it can only move up to this square and it can move up to the squares that I had pointed out before. So it cannot capture its own piece and it cannot jump over its own piece. So the scope of the rook is limited to these squares only. So for the reason the rook is called the castle is because the king and the rook can do a special move in which the king moves to the corner of the board where it's safe to talk away from the attack. So this is the king side, as you can see. So just in case the king has not moved and the rook has not moved, and what it can do is that it can move to the z file and the rook can move over to the f file and it is safe to tuck away in the corner. So this is called the king side castling. So one more thing I want to denote for the king side castling is that just in case there is an enemy, let's say an enemy piece that blocks the way to the castling square. So for example, king needs to go over here and rook needs to come over there to castle, but the bishop is covering the square the king moves to. So at this moment, the king cannot actually castle into the move. But let's say, for example, the enemy piece is actually attacking our rook. So at this moment, can we castle? The answer is yes, because the pieces, the squares on which we will castle into is not being covered by the enemy piece. So we can still castle like this. Now let's say, for example, instead of the enemy piece covering the square on which we will be casting into, and it is not attacking our rook, but instead it's attacking our king. So it's currently in check. So what can we do? Can we still castle? So the answer is no. We cannot castle in such a position. So the king will have to either move or block with another piece. So at this moment, we cannot castle. Now let's look at casting on the queen side. So casting on the queen side is similar to casting on the king side. So this is our queen side. So how the pieces move is that the king goes to c file and the rook goes to d file. And this is called queen side casting. Now for the queen side casting, it is similar to king side casting. Just in case there is a bishop or let's say an enemy piece that covers the casting square, on which the pieces will be moving into, then then the casting right cannot be exercised and we cannot castle. So just in case if it's like attacking the rook, it's the same thing like wise at the as the king side casting. We can still castle. Now let's say for example, there's an enemy piece that's going for this square, right? So at this moment we can still castle because it's not affecting our casting right, because the casting square on which we will be moving into is the C and D file squares. So C1 and T1. So rook and king can still perform the casting move. So now let's talk about the queen. The queen is the strongest piece on the board because it can move like the combination of a bishop and a rook. So for example, can either move diagonally or in a straight line. So by just being in a single square, it can control a lot of squares. Can control the squares that is just next to it, and also it is a long range attacking piece. So you can look at the squares like that of a bishop and like that of a rook. Hence, we can say that the queen is the most powerful piece on the board and you have to use her wisely. So, likewise, as that of a rook and bishop and any other piece is the same thing for the queen. So, let's say there is an enemy piece on the board. Let's say there's a knight. So, how the queen can move is that he can either go there and capture the knight, or it can move up to the square, till which she has the vision for. So same thing if there's your own piece on the board or a pawn. So let's say there's a pawn on the board. So the queen cannot actually go to that square and she cannot actually capture her own piece. So she can either go to the square to which she has vision for and all the other places she has vision for. Now let's talk about the knight. So how the knight moves is that it can go to squares vertically or horizontally, and then it needs to move one square to either the left side or the right side. So it's the same thing here too. Can either go up or down. It's the same here. Can either go left or right. It's the same over here. Can either go up or down. So these are the squares on which the knights can move on to. Now, unlike the other pieces, the knight is a special piece. So why the knight is considered a special piece is because knight can jump either the enemy's forces or its own forces and reach the square that it wants to go to. So let's say, for example, it wants to go to F6, this square, then it can jump over the rook and reach over there. And similar thing with let's say the G5 square. It's the same thing. The knight can jump over the pawn on F4 and reach the G5 square. So the knight doesn't actually capture the piece over which it jumps. So the pieces over which it jumps are unaffected by its movement. As for how the knight captures a piece, is that if there's a square on which it wants to move to, and there's an enemy piece over there, then it can capture that piece and occupy the square. Now let's talk about the king. The king is the most valuable piece on the board. It's always not the strongest, it's actually the most valuable because if your king is checkmated, then you are defeated. And if you checkmate the opponent's king, then you win the game. So let's say, for example, this is the king and he wants to move someplace. So how the king moves is that he can only move one square at a time. So he can either move one square vertically or horizontally or diagonally, one square at a time. So let's say he wants to reach this square, then he can move over there. Then after the enemy moves, he can move again. And after the enemy moves, he moves again. So he can only move one square at a time. So although the king is the most valuable piece, it is not the strongest piece. The strongest piece is the queen, as we have discussed before. Now, unlike the other pieces, the king cannot step into the squares on which the enemy forces might keep an eye on. So let's say, for example, the bishop is eyeing these squares next to the king. So if the king wants to move, then he can either move to these squares, or he cannot move to those two squares. So why the king can't move on to those squares? It's because the king is the most valuable or the most important piece in the chessboard. So if he steps onto those squares, then it's called, if it's in those squares, then it's called being in check, and the king cannot keep itself in danger and not do anything about it. So that's the reason it's illegal for the king to step onto the squares on which it may be captured. Now that we have learned about the movements and placement of pieces and pawns, let's go into face value of all those pieces. First, what is face value? It is the value assumed at the start of the position, which will act as the basis to understand your current position while in the middle of the games, as we delve into strategies later on in other videos. So the first one is the pawn. Pawns have the lowest face value in the chessboard with a face value of 1 point. Because the pawns are the weakest resource at their disposal compared to the pieces due to their limited movement ability, vulnerability, and lack of long-range attacking prowess. However, due to their strength in numbers and their ability to act as a fast response, which can be traded off to control key squares, especially the central square, they are extremely good in securing outposts. If you don't know what outposts are, let me go into the definition of outposts in chess. An outpost is a square where your own piece can be planted and not easily dislodged. And the square is often defended by your own pawns, and the opponent's side is unable to attack the square with their pawns. Before we go into pieces, we need to talk about the term major and minor piece. So to help you understand it in short, I'm going to tell you that the major piece is able to checkmate the opponent's king with the help of its own king if the enemy king is alone, while minor piece is unable to do so even with the help of its own king. So major pieces are going to have a higher face value than minor pieces. So the major pieces are the rook and queen, and the minor pieces are the knight and bishop. Now let's resume the topic of face value as we have already talked about the pawns. The second I want to talk about is the knight. The knights have a face value of 3 points. The knight is the only piece that can be developed on the first move without the movement of a pawn. So for example, you can see on the screen, this knight can jump over its pawn and reach the f3 square. Now, most of the times, knights are considered to be the best piece to occupy the outpost square. They are good pieces to maneuver into better squares when both sides are trying to gain advantage in the close position. So, unlike the bishop, which can only move to the square of the same color it is started on, knights can alternatively move onto both light and dark colored square. Knight, with its unique movement ability, can sometimes catch the opponent off guard if they are unsuspecting too. The third is the bishop. Although knights and bishop are said to have a face value of 3 points, the bishop is slightly favored as it is a long-range attacking piece and it can eye the square on the opponent's territory from its starting square when the pawn just diagonal to it moves. So we can say that the bishops may have a face value of 3.15 at the start of the game. Most of the times, bishops are able to dominate knights when the battlefield might fizzle out into an endgame, as bishops can move from one side of the board to the other faster than a knight and may be able to control the movement of the knight too. Say, for example, in this position, we can see that the white bishop is covering all the squares that the knight can move on to. So these squares. And so without the help of his king, the knight is helpless and it can't move from its position from here. The fourth one is the rook. Rooks are said to have a face value of 5 points, as rooks are long range attacking piece, can take control over a file, and it's able to easily move on to either light or dark color squares as it desires. Rooks are able to make a special move with the king called castling and safely tuck away the monarch in the corner during the middle phase of the game, where both sides are trying to assert control over the opposing side's territory. The rook is a great piece to help escort the pawn to the promotion square, especially during the endgames. The fifth is the queen. Queen is said to have a face value of 9 points, as the combination of rook and bishop may give it 8 points. But since it can move as either a bishop or a rook at will, it will get a +1, making it have the face value of 9 points. The queen is the most powerful piece on the chessboard, with it being able to move both like a bishop and a rook combined. It is the best attacking piece and can oftentimes easily come to the aid of the defense if need be. Hence, it might be why there are two of each pieces for the bishop, rook, and knight, but only one queen. The last one is the king. Although king is the most important piece on the chessboard, and we can say its value is infinite, the king can be given a face value of 2.5 to 3 points, as oftentimes during endgames, it is the monarch which will be used to guide the pawns to the promotion square to get a powerful piece into the fight. The king can oftentimes be overlooked because of his vulnerability, but a good chess player should know that the king is an attacking piece during endgames and should use the monarch wisely. That's it for the video on chess pieces. Hope you liked the video, and if you have any comments or questions, let me know in the comment section, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.